Welcome to Shadowed Tales Archive. Tonight, we invite you to descend into darkness with a chilling anthology of horror stories, each one inspired by true events. This is episode 23. Let the nightmare begin. The Ghost Behind the Counter. It was the year 2000. I was 17 years old, a junior in high school, and I had a shitty, low-paying job at a rinky-dink discount store that, at the time, was just a step above something like a Dollar General or Family Dollar. My boss was a bitch, and I only made $4.15 an hour, the bare minimum wage at the time, if I recall. Needless to say, I needed a better job. This is what led me to our local dairy castle in town, and in August of the year 2000, I began my tenure there as a cook. I didn't really like the job, and at the same time, I didn't really hate it either, but with a spiffy $1, or thereabouts, raise in pay, I couldn't complain. The weird stuff didn't begin until about a month later. I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. When I turned to look, it disappeared, much like one of those floater things that show up in your eyes from time to time. This went on for a while, and it seemed like the more I tried to look at it, the more I thought about it, or the more attention I gave it, the more inclined it was to appear. Now, although it may sound like it, I hadn't yet realized or even thought that whatever I was seeing was an intelligent entity. I guess I thought that it was just one of those things, whatever that means. It wasn't until a few months later, in the fall, that the whole supernatural element of it all dawned on me. Myself, our shift leader Kyle, and Marissa, the drive-thru girl, were getting ready to shut down for the night when the drive-thru window opened by itself. To my surprise, neither of them made a big deal out of it. What the hell was that? I said with a chuckle. Oh, that's just the Watcher, Kyle said with a cheeky grin. The Watcher? What's that all about? I asked, intrigued. Whenever anything weird happens around here, we blame it on him, he answered. You mean this place is haunted? I continued. Oh, I don't know, he answered, slightly annoyed. We just say the Watcher did it when something like that happens. What else happens? I kept on. Sometimes people see stuff out of the corner of their eye. Sometimes they hear their names being called and stuff like that. Kyle didn't seem to want to talk about it anymore. I've seen stuff like that. It goes away when I turn to look, I said. Yep, that's exactly what happens, he concluded. The drive-thru window opens by itself all the time. I'm surprised you never noticed before, Marissa interjected. Cool, I said. Now, at the time, I couldn't have been more excited about all this, and I'm sure my coworkers could tell. You have to remember, this was 2000, and it seemed like the supernatural or paranormal was flooding pop culture, almost as much or more so than it is these days. Now, you have stuff like Paranormal Activity, Insidious, The Conjuring, and all the ghost hunting TV shows. Whereas back then, the Blair Witch Project had been released a year prior, The Sixth Sense was fresh on everyone's mind, and MTV's Fear was popular in my circles. While there maybe wasn't as much to whet everyone's appetite, it was just enough to keep interest peaked. Everyone was into ghosts. It went on like that for many months. Seeing things out of the corner of my eye, the drive-thru window opening on its own, and I even heard my name being called once in a while when no one was in the vicinity. Like I said before, the more attention I paid to it and the more I thought about it, the more it happened and the clearer things seemed to get. And then something touched Marissa. It was a particularly busy spring. I live in a college town, and the students had begun to move into their dorms. With Dairy Castle being the only chain restaurant in our small hick town, they came in droves that day and night. I was finishing up an order when I heard a shriek come from the walk-in refrigerator. I and a few of my coworkers ran back to see what was going on. We found Marissa on the floor. She was sitting up, but she looked almost like a broken doll in the position she was in, and she was fucking terrified. You okay, Riss? Someone asked. She didn't answer. Marissa? Someone else said. No answer. Riss? I said louder. Hey. She answered very meekly. You okay? I asked. Something knocked me down. I don't know what it was, she said, trembling. What knocked you down? You can't fit two people in here on a good day, and no one was back here with you, a coworker said. Are you sure you didn't slip? I didn't slip. Something knocked me down. I don't know. risk included. To this day, I don't think I've seen anyone as scared as she was at that moment. She quit the next day. I've only seen her one time since then, and she was far from the same girl she was before. Her experience really fucked her up, and to this day, I think there's more to her story than she was willing to share. We were all sad to see Marissa go. She was a sweet girl and wasn't hard on the eyes. Many of my coworkers chalked the incident up as she was just crazy and other shit like that. Myself, on the other hand, I couldn't help but think it had something to do with the watcher. The usual weird stuff kept happening more and more. It literally became an everyday thing. We all got used to it and would acknowledge whenever something happened, and being young and stupid, we laughed at it sometimes. This is around the time I started feeling a sense of dread whenever I would go out back at night for a cigarette break or to take the garbage out. The dumpster was about 20 yards away from the back door of Derry Castle. Even with the dusk to dawn light, it was downright creepy and dark at night. Every time I went to take the garbage out at the end of the night, I felt like something was watching me or was about to jump me from behind. There is absolutely no mistaking that feeling. All of this culminated one night when myself and Jamie, a new trainee, were emptying the garbage at the end of the night. As I was tossing the bags into the dumpster, I saw Jamie staring at something beyond the few pine trees that were planted behind Derry Castle. He had a look on his face that reminded me of a kid whose dog had just been hit by a car. "What's wrong, dude?" I asked. "What the fuck is that?" He pointed. I looked in the direction he was pointing and saw a disembodied head floating in the distance between two pine trees. That's what it was. There's no mistaking it. A floating fucking head. I could even make out a goatee and a very disturbing scowl or frown. This thing wasn't happy. Jamie darted back toward Derry Castle. I couldn't move. I could only keep looking at it. I will never forget that face or the look it gave me. By the time I caught up to Jamie, he was banging on the back door and begging for anyone to let him in. I scrambled in my pocket for the keys, the back door locked behind you. When I got the door open, he took off inside, and in front of a crowd of customers, he exclaimed, "There's a fucking ghost outside." He was sent home and subsequently fired the next day. Following that, we were all chewed out by our store manager. No more talk about ghosts when customers are around. You can talk about it amongst yourselves, but I don't want it getting out that our store is haunted. She was dead serious. No pun intended. As usual, the normal stuff happened, and somewhat to my chagrin, there were no more disembodied floating heads behind the store. I won't lie, and as I told you before, as much as this shit kind of scared me, it intrigued me even more, almost to the point where I encouraged it. I hate to admit it. And then 9/11 happened. On September 11th, 2001, I woke up around 2 p.m. to a shitstorm. I walked into my kitchen where my aunt May had the TV on. The tragedies of that day are well documented, so I feel no need to elaborate. Tragedy or no, I had a report for work at 5. When I arrived at Derry Castle, of course all anyone could talk about were the attacks and how horrible everything was. I recall people lining up in droves at the gas station next door and filling their tanks in fear of a gasoline shortage. There was absolutely no mention of the Watcher or any of the strange goings-on at Derry Castle, and I don't recall any spooky activity that night. We were all so caught up in the 9/11 attacks that a ghost or ghosts were the least of our worries. In short, we weren't fueling any activity, so I guess the Watcher didn't bother showing up. In fact, after that, I don't recall ever seeing or hearing anything at Derry Castle ever again. But that didn't stop it from following me home. I had a bad habit at the time of leaving my TV on all night long at a pretty loud volume. So loud, in fact, that my Aunt May would come into my room at night and turn the thing off. One night, I woke up and I saw someone standing at the foot of my bed. I paid no mind to it because I thought it was my Aunt May coming in to turn the TV off and to check on me. This was also a regular thing because I've been a severe asthmatic most of my life, and like any worrying aunt, she takes care of me. I woke up the next morning and my TV was still on. This was weird because I had clearly seen my Aunt May in my room last night, so why would she leave it on? especially with as loud as I had it. "Hey, did you come into my room last night?" I asked my Aunt May. "Nope. I was so tired that I didn't bother." "Why?" she asked. "I thought I woke up and saw you standing in there." "Just asking," I said. "Nope, wasn't me. Maybe it was the devil after you," she joked. "The devil, eh?" I chuckled. Well, I didn't think it was Satan after me. The Watcher certainly entered my mind. Not long after that, my sister and I were sitting on the floor of my room playing a PlayStation game. At the time, I had a 32-inch TV. This was before flat screens, sitting in one of those big plywood entertainment center deals with shelves and a couple of storage compartments on the bottom. We were very engrossed in our game when one of the doors of the storage compartment opened on its own. My sister was a bit startled. I didn't even notice at first. "What was that?" she asked. "Do what?" I said, pausing the game. "The door opened by itself," she pointed. "Oh, really? That's weird." I started playing the game again and didn't really think about it again until I started putting this whole thing together in my head. The Watcher was just saying hello again, apparently. By this time, I had moved on from Derry Castle to a different job. I didn't think much about the Watcher for quite some time until one day I had Kyle, my former shift leader, over for a visit, and of course the topic eventually came up. "So, does the Watcher still come around?" I asked. "Oh, but nowhere near as much as when you were there," he said with a giggle. This, admittedly, struck a chord with me. With as much shit that was going on when I worked there, you're telling me that now all the Watcher was just a minor annoyance? What was the deal? I mentioned this to a girl I knew at the time who was heavily into the occult and a bit of witchcraft. She informed me of something that I didn't really know much about at the time and have given a lot of thought to since. I was giving this entity, whatever it was, energy by talking about it with my coworkers and encouraging it. So, I go and do what any dumbass 19-year-old would do. I started talking about it and encouraging it even more so than before. After that, I began hearing little knocks, bangs, and clicks in my bedroom. I started seeing figures out of the corner of my eye again, just like I did at Derry Castle. Remember the story where I thought I saw my Aunt May in my bedroom, standing at the foot of my bed? That happened again, only it was standing by my head this time. That really gave me a start. The doors on the entertainment center continued to open on their own, and more frequently, often with witnesses, my sister once again being one of them. My bedroom was the only room in the house where anyone experienced anything. Nothing happened in the rest of the house. All of this seemed very cool to me, at least for a little while. Yeah, well, it stopped being cool, and it started getting really fucking scary. As if it wasn't fucked up already. I've always been a fan or enthusiast of the dark side of things. Whether it's movies, music, books, what have you, I have always ventured on the weird or different side. Hence why I was so enthusiastic about the supernatural or paranormal. Having said that, the phenomenon known as sleep paralysis wasn't unfamiliar to me. While at the time, I hadn't yet suffered from this, I had read a little about it. I had heard about how it is one of the most frightening, nerve-wrenching experiences that a person can go through, and about how, back in the Middle Ages, and perhaps even further back, they thought it had a lot to do with the supernatural/paranormal/spirit world/etc. Around the time all of this paranormal activity hit its peak in my home, or to be more precise, my bedroom, I had my first and most horrific to date bout with sleep paralysis. The first time is always the worst, I hear. The Sentinel Tree. People always have pondered what another intelligent being would be like. They've always theorized that these beings would be light years away and that us, humans, will be dead a very long time before we ever made contact with them. Other people say that they have already met them after being abducted and experimented on. Then some will say that we're the only intelligent being there are or ever will be. Well, I can say one thing for sure, and that's that no one was right. We were all so very wrong. Back when I was a teenager, I'll admit I was a smoker and an avid drug user. I'd done most drugs that were deemed safe for my friends, such as LSD, MDMA, DMT, many prescription drugs, and I even had a phase where I did some over-the-counter drugs. As a teen, I like to think I played it smart by only doing those every so often and stick with my main fix. Weed. I used weed almost as a social tool to some extent. What I mean by that is it got me to meet people who all were similar to me in at least the one aspect. We just wanted to get high. Around the end of my sophomore year, I met this kid named Mason at a party, and we quickly found out that we had a lot in common, so we became friends. When summer came, I'd hang out at his house, which was out in the middle of a forest, at least 4 or 5 times a week. While I was at his house, we'd barely ever go inside because his parents never liked anyone in there. Instead, we'd go to his barn, which was filled with cats that were most likely illegally being held. You're probably thinking why the fuck someone would hold cats in a barn. His mom actually bred some very expensive cats, ranging from around $500 to $3,000. She never had a permit for it either, and most of them were very maltreated by barely being fed or given water. Anyways, we would hang out in that barn for hours every time I came over, and all we would really do is smoke weed and cigarettes. We grew bored of that after a couple of weeks. Since there wasn't much to do so, he started to show me some cool spots throughout his neighborhood. Some of the places were just a great view, like this place we called the Ledge, which was on a small mountain. From the ledge, we could see the entire forest stretch out so far that we couldn't even come close to seeing the end of it. Then there were spots that were just cool, like the cliffs, which are pretty self-explanatory from their name. My favorite place was what we called the Old House. The Old House was long abandoned and located down a long driveway with many no trespassing signs, but we had thought that whatever the owner didn't know wouldn't hurt them. The house was a 3-story building that looked as if no one had lived there for probably around 50 plus years. As you could imagine, the house was obviously decently decayed and very neglected by wildlife and everyone that had been there. All the windows were busted out, parts of trees grew inside the house. The floor was broken in, parts of walls were missing showing the inside of the wall, which most likely was filled with asbestos. The walls that weren't broken and had graffiti covering almost every inch possible. The house's obvious property was pretty big, probably being a couple of acres. Decently thick brush surrounded the yard and a side building that was presumably an outhouse. The house and its property also had an eerie feel to it, but what abandoned house doesn't? Most of the time we would visit there during the day, but I personally thought the best time to go was at night. The rush I would get from this place past dark was unreal. Only people who have been in an abandoned house in the middle of the forest overnight would know what I mean. I had only done this a few times as I would go alone because Mason would refuse to go there during the night. One night, we were at the barn around 2000 hours, and I was trying really hard to convince him to come with me to the old house. Like always, he constantly said no. This ended up making me mad, so I demanded him to tell why he wouldn't come with me. He sighed and said, "Well, this is going to seem a little ridiculous, but I saw something in the forest by there." "Well, what the hell does that have to do with anything?" I replied, "I'm just worried that it would come to the house during the night." "That what would?" He sighed and began to tell me what he saw. Back when he was 9 or 10, he and his friend Tyler wanted to find a spot where they could go to get away from both of their families. After a few weeks of exploring through the woods, they came across the old house, but in a slightly different state. Apparently, there were around 9 or 10 paths all around the house where the brush grew now. He and Tyler would try to always explore one path every time they would go to the house until they ran out. This would allow them to have something new to do every time they visited. Some paths took a couple of days as they would walk pretty slow, at first absorbing the scenery of the forest and its inhabitants. When they would turn back, they would leave a marking in the ground or put a pile of sticks together and leave it at the furthest point they reached. The next time they would visit the old house, they would quickly walk past everything they have already seen until they go to their checkpoint. They never found anything interesting enough on these paths to actually keep, but a few weird things began happening. Oddly enough, it was only on the final 3 paths. Mostly the mysterious happenings affected the checkpoints. The checkpoint at the first of the three was just a stack of sticks tied together by some long pieces of grass. He and Mason came back the next day excited, as they always were when they explored one of the paths. Eventually, the checkpoint came to view, but it wasn't how they left. The sticks were ripped into pieces in a pile. This didn't bother either of them, though, since they thought it was maybe a fox or another animal in the woods. Mason said, looking back now, it wasn't possible for any animal to make those sticks look like that. The second of the three checkpoints was comprised of 4 sticks jabbed into the ground in a square pattern. Tyler was going to be out of the town for the next couple of days, so was there for a few days. The day he came back, they both went happily down the path. When they finally arrived at the checkpoint, there were 3 more squares of sticks in the ground next to the first one, making a giant square of sticks. This made both of them a little uneasy, but they kept going down the path a little more hesitant. Nothing else out of the ordinary happened on the path. They ended up exploring the last path all the way on the same day. Half of it was explored during the day, in which they made a star in the ground with a stick. Both of them were very eager to finish this one, therefore they made a plan. At exactly midnight, they would both sneak out of their houses and meet up at the old house. Tyler was supposed to bring 2 flashlights, while Mason was going to bring 2 of his father's pocket knives. Everything went exactly as planned. They met up and started going down the path. Mason and Tyler quickly realized that the paths at night weren't as appealing to the eye. In fact, most of it was straight up terrifying. Neither of them would end up saying anything about it, because they both wanted to be brave. When they finally reached the checkpoint, they shone their flashlights on it, and what they saw would leave them breathless. Right next to the original star was another star that was sloppily drawn. Mason told me that it resembled what you would think a 2-year-old would draw for a star. The worst part was it was at least 1 inch deep and half an inch in diameter. At first, Tyler wanted to turn around and go home, but Mason convinced him not to. Mason said that someone probably saw them leave the property of the old house after the 6th trail. That person then began to mess with their checkpoints in order to scare them off, so they would stay off the property. Tyler thought about Mason's theory and came to the conclusion he was probably right, so they continued down to finish the path. Apparently, this path was very long compared to the rest. The further and further they went down the path, the weirder things got. On some of the trees, there were deep gashes, almost splitting some of the trees in half, and some of them were even knocked over. These sights became more and more common the deeper they went. Then they reached a clearing in the shape of a circle, probably being about 100 yards across. There was no grass and no trees except one. It was in the middle of the glade and had a tower built into it. Eventually, they would name it the Watchtower due to the structure of the building. The Watchtower was very crudely built out of wood and around 4 stories tall. On the bottom floor, there was a doorway that looked abnormally big. The second had a balcony above the door with no railing and its supports sticking in the ground. Next was the 3rd floor, which was pretty plain, only having what appeared to be a window. Finally was the 4th floor. It was almost like a roof, but not quite. Presumably, there was either a ladder or stairs leading up there. It had almost a railing around the perimeter. They didn't notice the 4th floor at first, because when they looked at it from an upward angle, it would appear as a flat roof. But that's when they noticed it. There was a very tall, humanoid creature standing on the top. This thing was looking in the opposite direction of Mason and Tyler, and most of its features were impossible to see in the darkness. Both of them stood absolutely still, staring at the creature for what felt like hours. Neither of them noticed how quiet the forest was until this point. In fact, it was so quiet that they both heard the ringing noise your brain makes up when there's no noise to hear. After a few minutes, it began to move about the top of the watchtower. The creature reached its hand up into the air, making a motion that looked as if it was stretching. What they saw would scar them forever. This thing had claws for fingers, but probably not the way you're thinking of. The sharp part of the claws was where the back of your finger would be leaving the other side dull. They were also opposable and probably around 10 inches long. Mason managed to hold back his scream, but Tyler wasn't so lucky. The second Mason heard a noise come from Tyler's mouth, he dived on him, tackling him to the ground, covering his mouth as they fell. Mason looked Tyler straight in the eyes and brought one finger up to his lips, letting him know to not make a noise. When they finally looked back over at the creature, he was looking directly at them. Both of their hearts stopped, and they held their breath, trying not to move a muscle. Fortunately for them, the darkness was the perfect camouflage, leaving them invisible to the creature. It began looking around them, frantically, almost as if it was scanning the area to find where the noise had come from. That's when they noticed a silhouette of the same thing, standing in the third-story window, looking in their direction also. Suddenly, the creature jumped from the roof, making a loud bang and a cloud of dust rising from the ground. Mason and Tyler both looked at each other and knew exactly what they had to do: run. They both ran as fast as they ever have. The way they came from, hoping the creature didn't see or hear them. After about 10 minutes, they finally came to a stop. Mason almost collapsed, but thankfully Tyler managed to catch him and softly lower him to the ground. Both of them sat there in utter silence, listening while trying to catch their breath. Neither of them heard a sound except for that of the local wildlife, which seemed to return to the forest. After a few minutes, both of them just walked home, not saying a word to each other. I was speechless, like who really would know what to say after hearing all that. Honestly, I thought it was all bullshit at first and responded with a really sarcastic comment about it being a nice story. But the look in his eyes after I said that convinced me otherwise. I asked him what happened to Tyler, and unfortunately, he moved across the country soon afterwards. Apparently, they managed to stay friends for a couple of years, but as time went on, they lost contact. We went to sleep after that, but I don't really think either of us got much sleep. Neither of us talked to each other for a couple of days, but then it went back to how it used to be. After a couple of weeks, I brought up the idea of going to the watchtower just so we can clear things up. Initially, he said no, but with a bit of convincing, I got him up to a maybe. I said we would do it smart this time and bring a gun or two and maybe some knives. This made him feel better, and he agreed, but we have to bring a few more people. We both called some friends and planned it for the next weekend. Sleep didn't come easy over the next week. I had nightmares about the watchtower and those creatures. Most of the dreams have either been forgotten or my brain subconsciously blocked them. Though that was not the case for one of the horror dreams. I was one of them. I stood at the top of the watchtower, hungry, looking out at the surrounding forest for anything that I could eat. Something moved in the woods, and I quickly looked where it came from. Darkness plagued the forest, making it very hard for my non-human eyes to see. Maybe it moved, I thought, and began looking around the general area I heard it from. Nothing. I descended the ladder that was behind me. I saw the silhouette of one of them standing, staring out the window. This started to make me uneasy in my dream as I began to realize that what I was couldn't be right. I kept going down the ladder and went past the second floor, and then I reached the first floor. The weird part was the ladder kept going down underground. Hesitantly, I went down it into the complete darkness. I kept going down and down until I noticed a light coming from below. The light got closer and closer until it was right below me. As I was about to see what it was, I woke up in a cold sweat. Not feeling good, I walked to the bathroom and threw up. A week had finally passed, and we all met up at Mason's house. I brought two of my friends. One was Blake, who was a bodybuilder, and Cody, who was just a very good friend of mine. Mason only managed to get one of his friends to come. His name was Shane, and he was a wrestler. We each brought something that could possibly help us on the adventure into the unknown. Blake brought a backpack filled with water and food, just in case we managed to get lost or if one of us was hungry/thirsty. Cody managed to take his dad's .44 Magnum with enough bullets to go through 5 magazines. Not sure what they are really called on a Magnum. Shane found an old machete in his garage a few months ago, and with a little convincing, his parents agreed to let him have it. So, of course, he brought that. Mason took his dad's shotgun and had around 40 bullets for it minus what was already loaded into it. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to bring anything that could be of much use, but but I brought a few pocket knives and for myself, a butterfly knife. We left for the old house at about 8 in the morning. The only reason we left so early was we'd rather face these things during the day. As we got there, we all immediately figured out our one flaw with this plan. The path didn't exist anymore. Fortunately, Shane had the machete, so he began to cut his way through the brush. We were all worried the whole path would be covered in this brush, but it was only for about the first 100 or 150 feet. The strange part was that after it ended, there was none for the rest of the path. All there was grass, nothing more, nothing less. We had been walking for an hour when Cody started complaining. "This is pointless, guys. We're never going to find anything," he said rudely. "Yes, we will," said Mason. "You sure this the right path, Mason?" I asked. "I mean, we haven't really seen anything out of the ordinary yet." "I think it is." "You think?" said Blake. "Almost positive. The only way it wouldn't be is if there was another path I didn't see before." While rolling his eyes, Blake said, "Well, I think it's about time we eat something." "I agree. I'm starving," replied Shane. So we sat there and ate. While we were eating, I sat there absorbing the scenery. It was about noon, so the sun was high up in the sky, lighting up everything that wasn't directly below the trees, which wasn't much. The light, or should I say the lack of light, allowed me to notice something odd. On the side of a tree, a part was slightly bulging out. I walked closer towards it when it hit me. "What the hell are you doing?" asked Shane. "Just come here, guys," I said back with a grim look on my face. As they walked next to me, they noticed it too. On the tree was one of the claw marks Mason had told me about. There were 4 total claws that caused it. Each mark was about 1.5 inches or 2 inches deep, while being about 1 inch across. There was a long silence between all of us for a couple of minutes, as we all took in what we saw. Cody finally broke the silence by saying, "Well, I guess this is the right path." "Told ya," said Mason. "I'm worried now," Blake said. "Don't be. If we come across one of these fuckers, I'll blow its head off." "But what if our guns and knives aren't enough?" "Well, I highly doubt that. But I guess we would just run for our life," replied Shane. We continued down the path, but this time we had our weapons ready for anything. There were more and more scratch marks on the trees. We all definitely felt the tension rising the further we walked through the path, as all of us began to talk less. Occasionally, I'd look over at my friends just to make sure they were okay, and all of them, minus Mason, had a look of fear in their eyes. The look Mason had was that of regret and terror. After what felt like hours of walking, we noticed an opening far ahead. Although blurry, we could make out the watchtower. "Fuck, fuck, fuck," Mason said with a hushed voice. "What?" I asked him nervously. "We gotta get out of here now." "Why? What's wrong?" asked Cody. "The watchtower has at least doubled in size since I was last here." I started to step back towards Mason when I heard a loud snap, and suddenly I was stuck in a net. It began swinging violently, and I hit my head on a tree and got knocked out. Slowly, I started to become conscious. I opened my eyes and was blinded by light, so I quickly closed them tightly shut. The light made me notice my horrific headache. At this point, I was still very disoriented, so I wasn't really worried. All the memories of what just happened began flooding back into my head. This made me not want to open my eyes. I was hoping maybe somehow my friends got me out of the trap and were just resting for a second, so they lied me down, but the noises I began hearing made me realize that was not what happened at all. It sounded almost like a voice, but it was very deep and malicious. Whatever it wasn't human, and there were definitely at least 3 of them. They were having a conversation about who knows what. I could only assume it was about me, which caused me to worry for my life and my friend's life. At first, I thought I should just keep my eyes closed and not move, but why stop the inevitable? Once I opened my eyes, I noticed that the light shining on my face was coming from a very strange light. The light source was surrounded by some type of glass in the shape of a cube, with little metal rods sticking out from each corner, emitting what I presumed was electricity into a glowing orb in the middle. Several of these hung from the unusually high ceiling throughout the room. About halfway across the room, a row of bars and a door came all the way across the room, blocking me off on the other side of the room. On my side, there wasn't really much at all. In a corner of the room laid a blanket and what I assumed was supposed to be some sort of pillow made purely from cloth or something. The corner across from that one had a hole about a foot in diameter. It had to have been pretty deep too, because you couldn't see the bottom even with a light placed directly above it. At the center of my side was a huge pillar with some crazy type of writing wrapping around it from top to bottom. The other side was very weird. One of the corners was completely blocked off like it was an abnormally large cubicle. The other side had a couple of very big containers, almost like an 8-foot filing cabinet, except they only had a single drawer taking up where all the drawers would be. Along the back wall was a door, except it didn't have a doorknob. On the floor directly in front of the door was markings of what I assumed was another creature's footprints. Tubes hung from the ceiling in a very strange pattern. I kept hearing the voices I had been hearing earlier from the general direction the cubicle was at. Slowly the voices were growing in volume, almost like there was some type of tension in that cubicle. The louder the voices grew, the more malign they sounded. Eventually, it was almost like the creatures were having a full-out argument. They were what seemed to be yelling, occasionally stomping on the ground. The stomping was nerve-wracking at the least. Every time they'd stomp, it would shake the entire room, meaning the creature itself had to have been large. Very large. They kept arguing, getting louder and louder for what felt like hours until one of them finally left the cubicle. I wanted to vomit the second we met eyes. The creature was horrific. It was about 8 feet tall, very muscular, and looked like a humanoid. This thing's skin looked thick, almost like leather minus the brown color. Instead, it was a sort of a darker pink, but not quite red. One of the creature's legs would be as thick as a car tire and about 4 to 4.5 feet long. The feet looked almost human, but very large, and instead of toes, it had small versions of the claws described in Mason's story. Its torso was abnormally small compared to the rest of its body, but it still remained one of the most muscular parts of its body. Its arms were long, hanging down to about its knees, but the worst part was the dreaded claws it had instead of fingers. They were just like Mason described, except I could clearly see that they were a whitish yellow, almost like teeth, meaning they were most likely bone instead of whatever nails are made from. The face was the thing that stood out the most. Honestly, it still gives me nightmares today. Anyways, its head was very proportionate to the rest of its body, just like a human's. Its tongue hung out of the edge of its mouth, being significantly longer than the rest of its fangs. Which, might I add, it had several rows of fangs. The tongue was like a human's, except completely flat. There wasn't a nose. Instead, there were holes for nostrils, much like a snake. No ears existed either. Just holes like the nose, except it had some type of filter covering the ear, most likely blocking things from crawling in there. The hair was possibly the strangest part. It looked almost like rope hanging from its head, except you could tell each rope was a single piece of hair. Before I noticed any of those features, though, I noticed its dreaded eyes. Where the white is in our eyes, these things were black. The black took up a majority of its eyes, with a white iris that took up a space as thin as pencil lead. Red pupils were in the center of the eye. Anyways, I ended up calling these things wolverines because of their claws. After I threw up, I looked up at the wolverine as he looked back at me. A smile grew across his face, which sent a shiver down my spine. It stopped in its path, and we just stared at each other for probably about 5 minutes when he turned around. The wolverine quickly ran back into the cubicle. I heard the voices again until 3 wolverines walked from behind the cubicle. All of them stared at me with the same disturbing smile. Eventually one said something while staring at me. At first, I wasn't too sure who it was talking to, but it became obvious he was talking to me as he began saying the same phrase 3 or 4 times. Not sure what to do, I replied with the simple phrase of, "I don't understand what you're saying." It quickly frowned and began walking towards the door. The wolverine stood where the footprints were when they slightly moved down. The door flew open, and then all 3 wolverines walked out. For the next few hours, I was in there alone. At first, I quickly began looking around for an exit, but came to no avail. I gave up and just began thinking about Mason, Cody, Blake, and Shane. What happened to them? Were they okay? Did all of them get stuck in a trap? Who got away? Are they even still alive? All these thoughts started becoming too much, and I honestly started to cry. Hard. I probably cried for about 30 minutes when I started thinking again. At the time I thought, what's the point in crying? I mean, it's not going to get me anywhere, and all it's going to do is dehydrate me. And what if they don't give me water? It will only make the inevitable come so much quicker than I wanted. After a few hours had passed, a couple of Wolverines came back, except it brought a table with straps where my feet and hands would be. They opened the door in the middle of the room as I groaned, waiting for my fate. It picked me up with what felt like actual care, almost like a mom picking up its baby. This made me very confused at first until I figured out they were treating me like a piece of evidence, with care to try and not alter me. I was lied down on the table and was strapped in. One of them opened the door while the other pushed me. We went through a very weird hallway that looked like something like a hallway in an asylum, and ended up in a room I could only call an operating room. For a couple of minutes, the two Wolverines talked. After they finished, they began making marks all over my body where I presumed they were going to cut open. The Wolverine grabbed a knife and made an insertion in my forehead and my right arm. I guess the other Wolverine called him as he put the knife down next to my right hand. This was my chance to escape, to get away. I quickly began looking around for an exit. At first, I couldn't find any way out as I knew the door wouldn't work for me, but that's when I noticed another hole in the corner of the room, except it was slightly bigger than the one in my cell. I grabbed the knife and quickly began cutting the restraint on my right hand. While I was cutting it, I kept looking up to make sure they weren't paying attention, and fortunately they weren't. The first restraint took the longest to cut, but the rest only took a second. I was free, well, from the restraints at least. As quietly as I could, I got up and was crawling toward the hole when I heard it scream. For a second, I thought I went deaf. How incredibly loud that scream was. This disoriented me to the point of me not being able to move. I quickly managed to compose myself together while one was beginning to run towards me. I couldn't make a run for the hole because before I'd reach it, the Wolverine would get me. At this point, I still had the knife, so I did the only thing I could think of. I threw it straight at the Wolverine, hitting it in the head. The knife itself was very sharp, but due to the creature's thick skin, it only went in about 1/8 of an inch. Fortunately, this was enough to stun the beast for a split second. I quickly turned around, got to the hole, and jumped down. I could barely fit in the hole, so as I fell, I constantly hit the walls. I only fell about 50 feet or so until I hit water or some type of liquid. For some reason, it had a very strong current though, so it dragged me right along with it. The water was only a few feet deep, which most likely saved me from drowning. After about 15 minutes or so, I saw light from the way I was going. Happiness overwhelmed me the closer and closer I got. Finally, I got out of the cave or whatever I was in and was in sunlight. I quickly got out of the water on the side of the river and lied down, absorbing all the sunlight I could. I actually ended up falling in a deep sleep right there on the shore. I was in my bed, nice and warm. Feeling pretty content, I got up and went to shower. Hot water poured all over my body, cleansing every pore in my body. The kitchen was right above the bathroom, so I could always smell what was being made. My mom this morning was making eggs and bacon, so you know what my bathroom smelled like. I got out of the shower, dried myself off, got dressed, and went upstairs for an amazing breakfast. That morning we had a family breakfast, something we never usually do. My dad told elaborate stories about his childhood memories which would bring joy and light to each person in my family. My mom would talk about her job and getting a raise, which would mean things were going to change around here for the better. My sister talked about how she met this amazing guy and how she thought he might actually be the one. I rolled my eyes at this and laughed as I washed my plate clean. All of a sudden, I heard glass breaking coming from the basement. My dad said as quietly and frantically as he could, "Go upstairs, lock yourselves in your room, and don't make a noise." All of us did exactly as he said, except I went a little further and hid inside my closet. I sat there for what felt like hours and listened as closely as I could to try and hear what was happening downstairs. All I could hear was banging, which filled me with fear. Something was starting to come upstairs, and it sounded bigger than my dad. I held my breath and got in the fetal position as it started to walk towards my room. Whatever it was, it sounded like it had taken my door clean off the hinges. It walked toward my closet and opened the door. Looking right at me was a wolverine with a huge smile on its face. The monster picked me up and threw me towards the wall. That's when I woke up. When you first wake up, you're usually really dazed and disoriented, especially after a dream. Well, that's what I was like as I was flying through the air. I didn't really understand what was going on until I hit the tree. The second I hit the tree was the second I collapsed. I spit up a shit ton of blood and looked up. Staring straight at me was a wolverine about 30 feet away with the same grin on his face as the one in the dream. At this point, my adrenaline began rushing, but it wasn't too much help as I couldn't even really stand. The creature slowly began walking towards me, making the noise that I could only describe as laughter. I began looking around frantically, trying to find some way to get out of there when I noticed the river about 5 feet away from me. I quickly rolled into it as the current took me with it. As I began going down the river, I saw the creature quickly jump into it, trying to chase after me. I tried to swim with the current to make me a little bit faster, but it never helped much. The further and further down the river I went, the closer the beast got to me. At one point, it swung its claw towards me, but missed. While its claw was right by my leg, I quickly used all the strength in my body to force myself further away. Let's just say it didn't really work. Somehow, he countered it, grabbing my ankle and flinging me into the air further down the river, which I noticed turned into a lake. I crashed down in shallow water on the opposite side of where the river came out at. I knew this was the end of me. Both my legs had to be broken at this point, and same with my arms. The creature got dumped out into the lake, but something surprising happened. The creature flailed its arms in every direction, filling the air with that dreaded scream. I was very confused about what was happening at first, but then it hit me like a ton of bricks. It can't swim. It was drowning in the deep part of the water. I was filled with relief until I lost consciousness, most likely due to blood loss. I slowly opened my eyes and realized I was in a hospital bed. Looking down on my body, I noticed I was almost completely covered in bandages while both my legs and one of my arms were in casts. My mom was sleeping on a chair they had placed next to my bed. I smiled and said her name probably about 5 times until she woke up. I don't think I've ever seen my mom cry so hard or heard her scream so loud. Police questioned me over the next few days about what had happened. I didn't really know what to say, so I made up a story about how me and a friend went exploring down the river when I fell in, hit my head, and passed down the river. Next, they asked which friend, and I said Tyler. Apparently, Tyler had been missing for a couple of days now, way before I passed out in the river. I became the main suspect in his disappearance, but there was a lack of evidence to actually convict me. Recovery would take me years to become a fully operable human being again. In fact, they actually had to replace a few bones in my legs to get them to work like normal. One thing to this day still makes me very curious. What happened to Cody, Shane, and Blake? Did they go crazy? Maybe they just kept quiet about it? Or did they even get captured too? Honestly, who knows, but I can only assume they were probably captured too. Whenever you're in a forest and see a strange structure that doesn't look quite so normal, please get out of there. The Wolverines are probably there, and they have no mercy. They are way more powerful than us humans. If for some reason you do come across one of them though, find some nearby deep water and jump right in. Don't worry, you can swim and they can't. Well, that is unless they've learned how to swim since then. The Ashfield Asylum. Being a devout fan of creepypasta's true story section, I felt compelled to share my story with other users. While it is nice to provide all of you with a chilling and entertaining story, keep in mind I have a much greater goal in mind. Before my experience 2 days ago, May 3rd and 4th, 2013, I was a very skeptical person, not just in the paranormal, but in all areas of life. Should something not be able to be factually proven, it was simply not true. While I was always interested in death, the paranormal, and spooking myself in general, I had always been a hard-headed person who never believed that there was any truth to it all. I simply wrote things off as an interesting story and never genuinely believed that in anything unexplained. Following my experiences, however, I've come to terms with the fact that just because things do not follow our illusion of reason does not mean that those things aren't actually valid. As I had stated before, I have a greater goal in mind higher than simply entertaining my fellow creepypasta members. Contrary to my previous belief, there are things in life that cannot be explained, like the beginning of the universe and life itself. We can trace things back in theory, 13.7 billion years ago with the Big Bang, but the further into it you go, the more questions arise. And what before that, and before that? Great wars have been fought over the topic ever since the beginning of man itself. We are all fighting and scrambling to answer the unexplainable origin of the beginning of the universe. Why? Simply put, we are very intrigued about a topic that is so complex and abstract that could never be explained. This is why the creepypasta stories, true or false, are captivating. We all want to feed our hunger with a glimpse into the irrational world of the paranormal and incomprehensible. My goal above all is to show my peers that you must keep an open mind and simply give into the inevitable truth that some things in life cannot be explained. I apologize for the long prefix, but I felt it was an absolutely necessary one. Here are my experiences of May 3rd and 4th. Seeing as how it was a Friday on May 3rd, I was very glad to be on a small but much appreciated break from work and school. Naturally, I did the old teenager cliche of spending the night at a friend's house. As usual, I indulged in playing video games and criticizing old classic movies with my good buddy Dylan. We were a couple of film buffs who loved to share impressions of actors and poke fun at poorly done special effects, etc. The night was honestly going great in true weekend fashion. My friend and I had just come to the realization that he could do a pretty good Nicolas Cage impression. So we spent a large part of that night laughing and talking like him at random points in our hangout. When I had attempted to follow in and give the impression a try, he shot me down and ridiculed me for doing a bad job. I shrugged and tried to laugh it off, but he continued to pursue berating me. Eventually, I grew tired of his negative criticism, and we had a small argument. It was no big shouting match or anything. We were used to this sort of thing because we made fun of each other on such a regular basis. It was only natural to have a small little fight now and then. We always got over it within a day or two. I felt the best course was to gather my things and ride my bike home so we could both cool off a little. I was a little reluctant to bike home because it was really late already. I was no stranger to riding home in the dark. It was actually sort of routine because I got around a lot. It seemed I was always riding home in the late hours from someone's house. This time was different, however, because it was now 1:24 a.m., May 4th now. I had only ever ridden my bike out past midnight only once or twice before, and only for an absolute emergency. I refrained from riding when it was very late because I always had a fear of gangs and other not-so-great characters who tended to be out at that time of night. Clouded of my better judgment by pride and anger, though, I put on my backpack, hopped on my bike, and started off. I recall the cool summer breeze that I had felt as soon as I began to ride home. It was very therapeutic to feel the wind relieving me of my stresses. I was now confident that I had made the right call to leave my friend's house, rather than stay there and wait in awkward silence until we both went to sleep. I continued to ride home for another 10 minutes. At this point, I was at a crossroads. Do I ride down Ashfield or turn and head towards the main road where the prostitutes and gangsters usually hung out? I continued to go straight and head down Ashfield. Although this seemed like a no-brainer, it took some thinking and a fair amount of guts. Ashfield was a very tranquil street. It was filled with tall pine trees, little traffic, and certainly no shady characters like Blackstone. It was the quintessential biking trail for the town during the day, a biker's paradise. At night, however, it was much different. Ashfield was a bit of a historic part of town, so it did not have streetlights. There were so many trees that even the moonlight could not sneak through to illuminate the street. Me and my friends frequently joked that this was the darkest street in the world. Aside from being very dark, it was also very quiet. Even the sound of crickets would be relieving, because you would know that you were not completely alone. I had been riding on the street for a while now, and only had about 3/4 of a mile remaining until I was on my street. I had gotten kind of used to the street and was no longer nervous about the spookiness of the street. The solitude was actually quite refreshing. During the day, I frequently rode down Ashfield. As I had mentioned, it was a mecca for bike riders. I was very familiar with all of the buildings and fields on the stretch of road. So, when I saw an unfamiliar building, it stuck out like a sore thumb. At the end of a long, dry field stood a tall, menacing mansion of a home, like straight out of a classic horror movie. I could totally imagine a thunderstorm in the background, adding to the horrifying look of it. I stopped pedaling and slowly passed the building by. The curiosity of the building began to burn a hole in my head. I knew that if I did not stop and analyze the building, I would lose sleep wondering at what I had missed. I turned around and dismounted my bike and stared at the building in awe. On the front of the building was a green text, the same green that was used on this historic part town in Ashfield. I was nearsighted, which meant that I needed to wear my prescription glasses to see far away. I reached in my pocket and realized that I had left my glasses at Dylan's house in my hurry. I decided that I would have to get a closer look if I wanted to read what it said. I was way too enthused to simply call it a night on that note. I had to at least read what it said. I stepped onto the crunchy dry field and proceeded to walk towards the building. My imagination was running wild, thinking of what on earth this sign would read. My mind is drawing blanks now as to what I thought it could have said. Finally, I got close enough to make out the words. Ashfield Asylum. Under that was smaller subtext that I could not yet read. I did not know if I should continue to walk towards it or run like hell out of there. Once again, I figured I have to at least read it. I walked a little closer and read the smaller text. 978 in Ashfield. I was so puzzled. I was so sure that had I seen this terrifying building before, I definitely would have looked inside of it, and at the very least remembered that it was there. It's not very often you see an asylum, you know. Second, why would there be an asylum in the middle of all of these nice homes in the first place? All of the homes surrounding, and the asylum itself looked to be built around the same time period. The homeowners would have gone mad had they known a loony bin was built right next door. The asylum was obviously abandoned, as shown by the broken windows and poor upkeep. So at the very least, why wouldn't the neighborhood have at least petitioned to have the building torn down in recent years? None of this was adding up. I decided I should call someone and at least get their opinion. Should I go in? Then the grim reality reminded me that it was now about 2 a.m. All of family and friends were asleep. Maybe not Dylan, but he was mad at me. I contemplated going in and paced back and forth at the idea. My entire life, I had been kind of a play-it-safe type guy, afraid to branch out and try new things. In the past 2 years, I had tried to embrace the spontaneous life and try to learn to say yes. I had to be absolutely nuts to go into an abandoned asylum on a dark street at 2 a.m. by myself, mind you. But imagine what you'd find. I recalled watching YouTube videos of people who would break into condemned asylums and see what they found. The idea fascinated me, but at the same time, I didn't think I had it in me. I couldn't possibly, could I? Once again, clouded by my better judgment. This time by intense curiosity and the drive to take a chance and explore, I proceeded to look for an opening into the building. I circled the building and gave reasons like, that hole is too small, or I'd rip my shirt there. Soon I realized I was making sorry excuses to delay the exploration. I psyched myself up and crammed myself through a broken window. I saw no signs of graffiti, old soda cans, or cigarettes that would imply that anyone has been in here since it was boarded up and deserted. That scared me. If someone had been in here before, I would have at least known that whatever dangers may be in here, someone had encountered before me. I had a very annoying habit of scaring myself when having a clear, non-timid mindset was very important. I had a flashlight that I attached to my bike that I used to navigate the dark, cold building. Because this was virgin ground since the boarding up, the inside of the asylum was very well preserved. The white, flawless tile flooring still looked very sterile. Trust me when I say, neatness was much more scary than if the place was a wreck. It was very freaky. Papers were scattered about from when they were extracting files and sensitive patient information. But other than the papers, the place was pristine. Spotless, no mirrors broken, no cracked porcelain toilets, no piss and excrement all over the walls like you would expect. Next, I focused on paying attention to where I was and where I was headed. Where were the patients' bunks? Where were the operating rooms? And where was the morgue? It seems I was in the admissions area, where you would be checked in and out. I walked down a narrow hallway and found a cluster of operating rooms, complete with the antiseptic metal tables, stripped of all warm, comfortable sheets and pillows. I didn't find any scalpels or bone saws. I presume they removed those for health concerns. I scavenged through drawers and found surgical tubing, respirator masks, and sterile gloves, still sealed in the boxes. It was so odd to see that aside from the scattered papers and no chairs or furnishings, the place still contained a lot of things necessary to keeping an operational medical facility. I continued through the asylum and found that the pattern on the floor had changed. The tiles were a different color, almost like a yellow-brown, and the tiles were smaller. I noticed that every few feet there were drains on the floor. I looked up and around and saw lockers where I assumed scrubs and other gear was stored. I put it all together and made the conclusion that I was in the morgue. The drains had been strategically placed to allow for the draining of blood on the floor. A truly haunting thought. My whole time in there, I heard a few creaks and whatnot, but just blamed them on my stepping and the age of the building. I had been in there about 6 minutes when finally I heard something that absolutely made my stomach drop. The only thing that I could assign the sound to was a drawer of a morgue refrigerator slamming shut. The large lockers where the dead are stored before burial. I did not explode and bolt out of there. I knew that if I had done that, I would have gotten scared that something was right behind me chasing me. I tried to keep calm and walk out of that place without panic, but in the back of my mind, I knew that I had never been so scared in my life. After an eternity, it seemed, I jumped out of the window and landed back on the porch of the Ashfield Asylum. I ran through the field and got on my bike and rode home. It's not like my endeavor was over. I still had to ride nearly a mile home in anguishing fear on the dark, deserted streets of Ashfield. Soon, I was home safe and sound. I was so shaken up, I didn't think that I could return to living a normal life again. Falling asleep that night was very hard. I pushed through it, and the next day, I felt a lot better. Now, I suppose I could have sullied the story by making up some bullshit about how I saw a figure, or something touched me, or there was blood all over the walls. I know that some people would prefer to have some truly horrifying experience to make this long story all worth it, but I wanted to stay true to heart and not spoil a true and scary story. Need not worry, however, the story is not over there. Here is the paranormal, truly unexplainable part. I called up my friend Dylan, and it seemed the both of us were done being mad. I told him about what had happened and told him I'd meet him at his house in about an hour. I rode to his house and was there in about 40 minutes. I was very excited to tell him about it in person. He was so amazed that he decided he wanted to go and look at the asylum for himself. He also rode down Ashfield at least twice a year and did not recall seeing an asylum, night or daytime. I was very much still traumatized by last night, but I really wanted to show off the fact that I had gone into that scary fucking house all by myself. We decided we'd both take a bike ride down Ashfield to see the building. When we arrived there at about 3 p.m., 30 minutes later, we had some trouble finding the house. I recalled the length and shape of the field of the asylum, and I saw a field that matched it, but saw no menacing asylum on top of it. This didn't make sense, it didn't add up, just like the asylum being there in the first place. I didn't understand. But as I stated earlier, there are just some things in life you cannot explain.
And that was tonight's tale from the Shadowed Tales archive. If it left a mark on your mind, if the silence feels heavier now, then the story did what it was meant to do. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the darkness. New stories are always on their way. Until then, keep the lights low and the doors locked.